red-hot iron, the hiss of metal sinking into living flesh, the thick, suffocating smell of boiling oil and fear. A wooden box, no larger than the body trapped inside it, but built like a weapon. On its inner walls, hundreds of iron spikes rise like the teeth of some starving beast. Within it, a man struggles to breathe, but cannot move. His eyelids have been ripped away, so the world will never allow him darkness or escape. Day becomes night. Night becomes day. There is no difference anymore, only pain that does not end. This is not a legend from the mouths of poets. This is not a story softened by time. This is the fate that one man walked into with open eyes. What kind of human chooses torture over mercy? What kind of honor demands a death that history itself trembles to repeat? His name was Marcus Atilius Regulus, Roman consul, general, hero, prisoner. His life was a triumph. His death, a descent into the deepest limits of human endurance. This is not a war story. This is the price of loyalty, and the day a man chose hell instead of shame. In the 3rd century before Christ, the Mediterranean was not merely a sea. It was the battlefield of two titans whose ambitions could not coexist. On one side stood Rome, young but relentless, a republic of farmers turned soldiers, welded together by discipline, hunger, and a belief that the gods themselves favored their expansion. On the other side stood Carthage, ancient and wealthy, its harbors filled with merchant fleets, its palaces glittering with foreign gold, its influence stretching across the sea like a net woven through centuries of trade. For decades, these two powers measured each other with suspicion and envy. They negotiated, threatened, tested, and calculated, like predators circling in tall grass, each waiting for the other to blink. And when the balance finally broke, it shattered into the flames of what history would call the First Punic War, a conflict not just of armies, but of philosophies, cultures, and identities. In the middle of this colossal contest rose a man who embodied Rome's unyielding spirit, Marcus Atilius Regulus. Born into the old traditions of the Republic, he was raised to believe that honor was heavier than life, that glory was worth pain, and that loyalty to Rome was not a choice, but a sacred law written into the bones of every citizen. Regulus was not just a soldier. He was a symbol of the Roman ideal, austere, disciplined, fearlessly ambitious. When he became consul, not once but twice, he treated the position not as a privilege, but as a mandate to expand Rome's power. He believed Rome was destined to rule the world, and he was destined to carve the path. When the war turned toward the sea, Regulus did something no general before him dared. Carthage was the master of naval warfare. Rome, in contrast, was a land power with little experience in maritime battle. But Regulus refused to accept inherited limits. He transformed Roman infantrymen into sailors, turned merchant hulls into warships, and led a fleet across the Mediterranean with the audacity of a man who believed that obstacles existed only so Rome could learn to break them. Against all expectations, the Romans won, smashing Carthage's fleets and capturing dominance of the sea, a shift so dramatic that ancient historians recorded it with a kind of disbelief, as though they were witnessing the impossible unfold beneath the heavens. But Regulus was not satisfied with victory at sea. Where other commanders would have consolidated power, he pressed forward, and in a decision that shocked even his allies, he carried the war directly into Africa. His legions disembarked on Carthaginian soil, bringing fire and iron to the enemy's own doorstep. Town after town fell, farms burned, families fled, and for the first time in generations, Carthage knew the taste of fear. Their pride was shaken, their confidence wounded, and their leaders, desperate to halt the devastation, sued for peace. Yet the terms Regulus demanded were so crushing, so humiliating, that even defeat seemed preferable to acceptance. It was not a negotiation, it was annihilation disguised as diplomacy. And this is where the flaw in Regulus's greatness revealed itself. Victory made him fearless, and fearlessness made him blind. He saw Carthage weakened and mistook it for broken. He believed that one more push would erase them forever from history. But cornered enemies do not collapse, they evolve. And somewhere, far from Rome's gaze, Carthage reached for a weapon it had never used before, a man born for war, a strategist who understood not just how to fight, but where and when to break an opponent so completely that even memory could not repair the damage, a man whose arrival would seal Regulus's fate, a man named Xanthippus. Carthage, cornered and trembling on the edge of ruin, found its salvation not in noble generals nor seasoned admirals, but in a foreigner, a Spartan mercenary named Xanthippus, a man shaped not by politics or wealth, but by the cold arithmetic of war. He did not arrive with grand ceremony or an army at his back. He stepped off a lone ship, quiet and unassuming, a shadow among chaos. But the eyes that surveyed the city were not the eyes of a mere soldier. They were the eyes of someone who had seen empires rise and crumble, who understood that battles are not won by numbers or pride, but by position, momentum, timing, and fear. Carthage, desperate for salvation, listened, and Xanthippus, calm and clinical, tore apart everything they believed about how to fight Rome. He studied the battlefield where Carthaginian armies had failed. He saw legions fighting in hilly terrain where Roman discipline thrived, where the tight shield wall and the rotating line of fresh fighters created an unbreakable machine. But on the plains beyond, where there was space to move, space to run, space to thunder forward with overwhelming force, the Romans were vulnerable. Carthage possessed a weapon Rome could not counter, a weapon they had misused and misunderstood until now. Xanthippus reorganized the army not with speeches, but with ruthless clarity. He drilled cavalry to strike in coordinated waves, to control flanks like a pair of closing jaws. He trained infantry to hold long enough for the real blow to land. And he placed 100 elephants at the center, not as decoration or spectacle, but as the spear that would shatter the Roman heart in a single charge. Regulus, seeing Carthage take the field again, did not feel fear, he felt triumph. To him, this was arrogance, desperation wrapped in foolishness. He believed the legions would crush the Africans beneath iron discipline as they had before. The Romans formed their famous line, shields locked, spears readied, confident in an order that had never failed them. But Xanthippus was not fighting the Rome of memory. He was targeting the Rome of flesh and bone. At his signal, the elephants moved, a living avalanche of muscle, rage, heat, and unstoppable weight. They did not merely strike, they collapsed the Roman center. Shields were broken, bodies fractured, formation shattered not through strategy but through raw, inescapable physical dominance. Men who had marched across continents with unshakable pride now found themselves trampled into dust before they could even understand what had gone wrong. Once the center fell, the cavalry swept in from the sides, cutting off escape. The legions did not retreat because there was nowhere left to run. What should have been a battle became a slaughter. 30,000 Roman soldiers were erased from the field like chalk wiped from slate. Helms, banners, standards, everything that represented Rome's pride was crushed beneath African soil. And in the middle of that collapsing storm of shields and screams, Marcus Atilius Regulus was taken alive, not as a trophy, not as a hostage, but as a living statement, a reminder that Rome could bleed. They bound him, not cruelly, but deliberately. They marched him through the dust, past the bodies of his men, past the elephants that still dripped blood and heat, past the standards that once represented the endless march of Roman victory. And in that long, humiliating walk, Regulus did not lower his head. His pride remained, but pride is a blade that cuts both wielder and enemy. Carthage had broken his army, but they had captured something far more powerful, Rome's symbol of invincibility. They did not kill him. They saved him for something worse. Regulus was taken not to an honorable prison of war, but to a cell built to erase identity. Carthage did not need to torture him immediately. Time can be the most efficient executioner. He was confined in a dark stone chamber where the air was stale, where daylight never reached, where days and nights dissolved into one unbroken stretch of waiting. In that silence, a man's thoughts become louder than any scream. Yet Regulus did not break. He clung to the one thing Carthage could not take from him, the belief that Rome would remember him. He told himself that the Republic never forgets its heroes, that his name would echo in the Senate, that armies would march to bring him home. But wars do not pause for memory, and 5 years in captivity is longer than most legions survive in battle. As the war dragged on, Regulus became not a hero in Rome's eyes, but a ghost in a war report. The world moved forward, and he remained still, waiting. Then, one day, the cell door opened. Not with cruelty, not with triumph, but with calculation. Carthage had reached a stalemate with Rome. Both sides bled men, gold, and will, and neither could claim decisive victory. Diplomacy, long silent, returned as a weapon sharper than swords. Carthage conceived a plan as elegant as it was cruel. They would use Regulus, not as a prisoner, but as an ambassador of their peace terms. They brought him out, thin, weathered, bent not by fear but by the grinding erosion of time. They offered him clothes, dignity, passage, and a condition. He must swear an oath on the gods of Rome and Carthage that if the Senate refused the peace treaty and prisoner exchange, he would return to Carthage, to captivity, to suffering, and ultimately to death. For a man of lesser conviction, such an oath would be a formality. For Regulus, raised in the iron philosophy of Roman virtue, an oath was a chain stronger than iron, and he accepted it, not with hesitation, not with visible despair, but with the solemn clarity of someone who already understood the cost. His return to Rome should have been triumphant, but when he arrived, the celebration dissolved into horror. The people who ran to greet him did not find a victorious consul, but a man hollowed by years of confinement. His wife reached for him, but he stepped back, insisting that he no longer belonged to the city he loved, because his oath tethered him to Carthage. He entered the Senate not as a hero seeking glory, but as a messenger carrying the weight of two empires. The senators listened, expecting him to plead for peace, for mercy, for the exchange that would save his life and the lives of countless Roman captives. But as they watched him lift his head, they saw something that froze their breath. His voice was frail, but its core was unbroken. He delivered Carthage's terms with perfect clarity, and then, turning not as a supplicant but as a commander, he forbade the Senate from accepting them. He told Rome that the Carthaginian commanders held in their prisons were young, strong, and vital to future campaigns. Returning them would rearm the enemy. Meanwhile, the Roman captives held in Carthage were old, exhausted, stripped of their worth as soldiers, and their return would offer Rome nothing but pity. But his most devastating argument was not strategic, it was moral. If Rome began trading the lives of soldiers who had surrendered, it would teach the army that surrender was acceptable, that fear had value, that defeat could be negotiated. He declared that it was better for Rome that her captured soldiers die in foreign soil than return as proof that courage could falter. The Senate, shamed and stirred, agreed. Peace was rejected. And Regulus, bound now not by chains, but by his own unbreakable oath, turned to leave Rome. He walked not away from the city, he walked toward his execution. When Regulus returned to Carthage, he did not return as a broken man pleading for mercy, but as someone who had already accepted death the moment he stood before the Senate. Carthage expected fear, regret, or at least hesitation, but Regulus walked back into captivity with steady steps, as though every street, every shadow, every staring face was simply part of the path he had chosen. Yet the Carthaginians felt not admiration, but humiliation. To them, this man had turned their generosity into an insult. They had released him in the hope that he would save them from further war, but instead he had ignited Rome's resolve with even fiercer flame. Their anger was not loud. It was cold, controlled, and deliberate. Vengeance, when served without passion, cuts deepest. They began not with blades, but with the eyes, because to break the mind one must first break the world through which the mind sees itself. His eyelids were sliced away, not quickly, but with slow, practiced motion, the kind that suggests this technique had been perfected over many generations. Without the ability to blink, the eye becomes a wound exposed to the air, to dust, to sunlight, to the endless irritation of its own tears. But they did not leave him in the sun immediately. They placed him in darkness first, a darkness so complete that his sense of time dissolved. Without eyelids, the eyes strain to find shape in nothing, and soon the mind begins to hallucinate light, color, and motion. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Within that sealed void, time lost structure, and the boundary between waking thought and dream became a blur. Only when his mind hovered on the edge of collapse did they drag him out into the open. Carthage's sun was not the gentle warmth of the Mediterranean. It was a burning white furnace that filled the sky like a hammer. Forced to stare into that raging brilliance without the protection of lids, Regulus felt a pain not merely of light but of fire, as though needles of heat were being driven into the depths of his skull. His nerves screamed, his blood surged in his temples, and his thoughts became a storm of agony. This was not pain inflicted to kill. It was pain designed to erase selfhood, to turn memory, identity, and consciousness into raw instinct. When he did not break, when he remained silent, Carthage realized they faced not a man, but a belief given flesh. So they escalated. The final instrument of torture was a wooden box, narrow and confining, built to hold a man upright without allowing him to move or collapse. The inside was lined with hundreds of iron spikes, angled in such a way that every breath, every shift of weight, every attempt to relieve pressure drove the metal deeper into muscle and skin. It was not a device meant for execution, but for suffering that had no end. Regulus was forced inside, the lid closed, darkness returning. But this time, darkness had teeth. The wounds from the spikes bled, then clotted, then tore open again as exhaustion caused his body to sag, creating a cycle of fresh agony with no relief. Infection began, slow and relentless. The air inside grew hot and thick with the scent of blood and rot. Yet even here, he did not scream. And so, Carthage prepared the last act, the act that would become legend. They heated oil in great bronze cauldrons until it shimmered and spat, heavy and golden like liquefied sun. Not to plunge him into it, but to pour it over the box, letting the wood swell with heat, letting the iron spikes inside glow, turning the coffin into an oven in which pain became total, consuming, absolute. When the box was finally opened, the body of Marcus Atilius Regulus collapsed forward, ruined, blistered, shredded by metal and flame, unrecognizable except for the posture, upright to the final second. He had not died begging, he had died standing. When news of Regulus's death reached Rome, it did not arrive in the clean language of official dispatches or measured Senate announcements. It came carried by whispers, by fragments of traitor gossip, by the trembling testimony of those who had seen the aftermath or heard the Carthaginian soldiers speak of the execution with a mixture of awe and dread. At first, Rome did not believe it. The Roman imagination had not yet conceived of a death so deliberate, so precise in its cruelty. It sounded like the exaggerated horror of war stories, like myth spun by enemies. But as more confirmations arrived, each one resonating with the same grim detail, an emotional transformation rippled through the Republic. The citizens who once saw war as a duty of the state now felt it in their blood. Regulus had not simply died, he had been unmade. And in his unmaking, Rome found something more powerful than grief, purpose sharpened into vengeance. The Senate, which had once been torn by hesitation, now spoke with a single voice. Generals who had debated strategy with caution began preparing campaigns with a fervor that bordered on the sacred. Boys not yet old enough to grow beards begged to enlist. Veterans returned to service without pay. Households that had once complained about the cost of war now offered their fortunes willingly. Rome did not simply want to defeat Carthage. It wanted to erase the insult, the humiliation, the desecration of a Roman consul who had walked knowingly into suffering rather than betray the Republic. Regulus became not a name, but a standard, a rallying cry, a living accusation carved into memory. Yet behind the fury, behind the banners and speeches, there was another reaction, quieter but more devastating. In the home of Regulus, his wife Marcia received the news not with wailing, but with an expression described by ancient writers as cold as winter bronze. According to later Roman accounts, 2 Carthaginian generals of noble rank who were held in Rome were placed in her custody, and what she inflicted upon them in the cellar of her home became a dark mirror of her husband's suffering. Whether this is truth or propaganda is debated, but its symbolic power is undeniable. Rome was not merely avenging Regulus, Rome was answering Carthage in the same language of agony. But as the decades passed and the war twisted onward, something remarkable happened to the memory of Regulus. His story did not stay a tale of vengeance. It transformed into a moral lesson, repeated to children, soldiers, statesmen, and poets. He became the embodiment of the Roman belief that honor is heavier than life, that duty is not measured by comfort or happiness, but by what a person is willing to surrender for something greater than themselves. Philosophers and orators used his name as a torch held high in the darkness, proof that a single individual could define the spirit of an entire civilization. Whether every detail of his torture was literal, or whether some were embellished to strengthen Rome's resolve, the emotional truth remained hard as iron. The story of Regulus forces a question that does not fade with time. What is a life worth if the principles that define it can be abandoned to preserve it? Most people live their lives avoiding pain, avoiding sacrifice, avoiding confrontation with the core of their own loyalty. Regulus walked into it willingly. Whether one calls him a hero, a fanatic, a martyr, or a symbol, his legacy compels the listener to confront themselves. And so, his story survives not as a tragedy, but as a challenge. If this story moved you, if it forced you to feel something, if it made you question the cost of loyalty and the weight of honor, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. History does not repeat. It judges.